Welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning back in. Thanks to General Centracchio for taking the time to come in about the efforts to support the ALS Foundation here in Rhode Island. And also, I want to thank Patrick Moynihan from the Haitian Project for Skyping in, talking about his initiatives down there, as well as the controversial decision to not accept a $100,000 donation from Bob Kraft. Very interesting discussion with him. I have the honor of getting to fill in for news editor Kate Nagel and have a conversation with the professor, Jennifer Lawless at the University of Virginia. She knows everything that's going on down in Washington, D.C. Professor, thanks so much.
Of course. It's nice to talk to you.
A little busy down there in D.C. Let's start with Mitch McConnell, the senator from Kentucky, majority leader of the Senate, says nothing more to see here on this Bob Mueller investigation. Let's move along.
Right. And McConnell's comments are striking, I think, for two reasons. The first is that there's obviously a lot more to see. Democrats in the chamber believe that there is more to see. So McConnell is basically putting an end to this because he doesn't want, I think, probably Republican senators to have this albatross around their neck as they seek re-election in 2020. But the other reason that it's really significant is because the House is certainly not proceeding down that path. They're going to continue to investigate on as many dimensions as they can. And if we believe what Nancy Pelosi said today, they might even be open to impeachment proceedings. So it's possible that Mitch McConnell feels that this is done, but we have a bicameral Congress and we have people on the House side who haven't achieved that position or that clarity. So he might be putting the kibosh on things for right now, but it's certainly not going to go away.
Do we really think that the 16 pages, I think it's 16 pages of redaction out of a 400-page report, I think it was Jeffrey Toobin at CNN who said, you know, that's not very many pages in a document of this length. Is this just more partisanship, or is this that there's a real sense that there is a smoking gun within these redacted pages?
I don't think there's a sense that there's a smoking gun. I think the Democrats think that the 384 pages to which they've had access are a sufficient smoking gun. Mm-hmm. You've got literally hundreds of former prosecutors, Democrats and Republicans alike, saying that the document lays out a very clear case of obstruction of justice. So this is just one more dimension where I think they're trying to push and demonstrate that they would like as much information as possible before they decide how to move forward. But even if they don't expect to find anything new, I do believe that they think there's already enough there.
As the Senate develops and starts to look towards 2020, how many, in your estimation, we can cook report it briefly, how many of those Republican senators are in some level of potential distress who might not otherwise be in distress as a result of this lack of closure?
It's hard to know. There are two or three on the Republican side who are certainly vulnerable. It's unclear that this makes them any more vulnerable. Susan Collins is going to have a very, very tough race, and that would be the case regardless of what Mitch McConnell does. She did that to herself. Martha McSally is going to have a very, very tough race. That started the minute she was appointed to fill that seat. There are circumstances by which nothing will matter because the Democrats think that they can play in Maine, they can play in Arizona. And regardless of what Mitch McConnell says, regardless of what happens with this report, the Democrats are going to take an argument to the people of those states and say enough is enough. We need a democratically controlled Senate. So, I don't think that this matters, but I do think that McConnell doesn't want to be in a position where he's defending seats that he wouldn't otherwise have to defend because of this kind of behavior.
So a couple of weeks ago, Congressman Cicilline, who's a little bit of one of the leading mouthpieces for the House leadership, held a press conference here at his Pawtucket office, and Kate Nagel was there and said, these very questions about impeachment. And he said, well, it's not time for impeachment. He was sort of carrying the water for the House leadership. That's beginning to change, correct? Speaker Pelosi is now a little bit more in the discussion about impeachment.
That's right. And part of the circumstances that have changed is we're no longer only talking about the Mueller report. We're no longer only talking about obstruction of that investigation. investigation. The White House is now ordering people not to comply with subpoenas.
Right.
And when we get to the point where we have a complete disregard of separation of powers, when the White House believes and the president believes that the Justice Department work for him personally, we have a big breakdown in the way that our government and our democracy function and are structured. And I think we're beginning to see some degree of movement on the part of Democrats who are reticent to move forward with impeachment because it is such a political process. Because at some point you have to look around and say, wait a minute, no one is above the law. And right now what we're seeing is a president and people who worked for him or currently work for him who are just unwilling to comply with the law.
Could he nullify much of their narrative by implementing executive privilege on any number of these outstanding issues?
Well, so what makes that complicated is that many of these people have already testified,
Right.
and executive privilege was not invoked. So,
Right.
I think he could give it a shot and it would probably get to the courts, but it's hard to see what the argument would be. When he didn't think that they were going to say anything bad against him, Donald Trump was all for transparency. When the content of the conversation and the documents have shifted to things that could implicate him, he now wants to say that, they don't have the authority to have those documents, to turn over those documents, or to speak about those documents.
I've been alive for 2 impeachment processes and one level
I've only
or
been
another.
alive for one.
Yes, I'm a little older than you are. One was during the Watergate hearing process, never actually got to an impeachment process. And then the impeachment of Bill Clinton. This is big, it's loud, it will suck up all the oxygen in the American political spirit. What does Speaker Pelosi say to the 21 wildly inspired, energetic people who have put forth their effort to run for President of the United States as a Democratic candidate?
I think she's got to ask them, and they should also be asking the American people, how much is enough? And at what point does this debate become something that's not just about Democrats versus Republicans, that's not just about partisan politics, but it's actually about whether people are above the law? And if at some point a critical mass of these candidates or the members of Congress begin to believe that refusing to comply with subpoenas, obstructing justice, and telling members of the administration what they can and cannot do, or suggesting maybe that they lie is not acceptable, then I think they have no choice but to move forward. In 1998 and 1999 with the Clinton impeachment, the political debate was clearer. It was not exactly clear the extent to which Bill Clinton was trying to sort of put himself above the law in any dimension other than trying to keep an affair private. This is obviously beyond that.
One of the secrets to allowing the country to move forward during the Nixon period was that Republicans on the committee came forward and voted against their Republican president, Bill Cohen from Maine, a couple of others. We're not likely to see that in this situation. We may. Maybe Susan Collins will find
I think, Mitt Romney is probably the Democrats' greatest hope. He's
Right.
not vulnerable electorally. He has said some things that have been critical of the president. Why he didn't take to the Senate floor and say that what Mitch McConnell said is a complete travesty is beyond me, and it suggests that he's probably not going to be a leader on this front. But it's slim pickings. There are not a lot of Republicans to sort of spearhead a bipartisan effort. And the Republicans generally are, although probably disappointed with the way that Donald Trump is conducting the presidency, pretty happy with the policies and what the Senate has been able to accomplish or keep the House from pushing forward under Democratic control. So, there are just a lot of different moving pieces. And until people are willing to put the Constitution ahead of politics, I don't think we get far.
Speaker Pelosi had previously said, hey, listen, let's not get bogged down on this. We can win this thing. In the election of 2020, are these job numbers changing that? That the economy is so robust that there's a real political worry that the economy could be so strong that no Democrat, Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders or anybody else, any of the front runners in the existing polling, could overcome how strong the economy is.
So that would be the conventional wisdom. But if we've learned anything about the Trump administration and Donald Trump's campaigns, is that the conventional wisdom doesn't always apply. Trump's approval rating is ticking upward, but given the economy, it's unbelievable that his approval rating is as low as it is.
Right. It should be 97%, right?
Right. And so, in historically, what we've seen are good economies and low unemployment cue voters to evaluate the president on the grounds of the economy, and it can be very, very helpful. By the same token, a poor economy is something that they have to contend with. With Donald Trump, his evaluations tend to be pretty separate from the economy. And so if anybody will not benefit from the jobs numbers and the unemployment rate that we're seeing, it would probably be Donald Trump. Now, it's unclear if they're going to hurt him enough, if these other dimensions are going to hurt him enough. But, I don't think that this is the same thing as running against anybody else at a good economic time.
The other day, Senator Biden, former Vice President Biden, had a Jerry Ford moment in a famous debate with Jimmy Carter. Then President Ford did not understand that Poland was under communist rule at the time. It seems that Vice President Biden was unaware that Margaret Thatcher had died a number of years ago. Is that just a slip of the tongue, or is that a potential inclination that maybe the fastball, which was always mired in faux pas, is picking up a little steam?
I think it's both. This is one of these things where it's obviously a slip of the tongue. And if any other candidate, maybe apart from Bernie Sanders, had said it, it probably wouldn't mean much.
Right.
But when you're trying to push a senility narrative, this is a helpful ingredient.
Right.
And so, a slip of the tongue or a senior moment on the part of a candidate who people are already concerned with might be a little bit too old for the race is problematic. And so Joe Biden has to spend the next few days, I think, demonstrating a pretty clear ability to remember facts and statistics and present them in a way that suggests that he's completely with it. Again, this is just one of these things where the narrative is particularly problematic for him, even if the slip of the tongue was just as generic as it would have been for Cory Booker or Amy Klobuchar or any of the other candidates.
Yeah, as somebody who worked in the Senate for a number of years, the proficiency of Joe Biden of saying strange and unusual things over the 4 or 5 years that I worked down there was significant. I always make the comment, in 5 years, if United States senators made 100 silly comments, Joe Biden had about 50 of them. And that was probably about the right statistic. Joe Biden is the front runner. He has the highest name recognition, obviously, as being former vice president. But as we all know, these things take lots of twists and turns. And if we look at polling nearly a year ahead of primaries and caucuses, that those don't always prove to be proficient. If it's not Joe Biden, who is it in your mind? Who are the front runners absent Joe Biden that have the most interesting momentum and potential to tell the best story to attract Democratic caucus and primary voters?
Well, it's hard to imagine a scenario whereby Bernie Sanders doesn't remain a top-tier candidate. Now, Joe Biden has peeled off more of Sanders' support than he has anybody else's, but Sanders had more support to peel off. So I don't think that that's necessarily that damning. He was the runner-up for the nomination in 2016, and I think he'll be around for a long time. Kamala Harris looks like she's beginning to pick up some steam. Her questioning her committee questioning last week was very, very sharp. She garnered quite a bit of attention nationally, and it seems like she's she's trying to use that to propel herself forward. And Mayor Pete is still around.
Right.
I think a lot of it comes down to what his debate performance will be like, but he certainly offers an alternative that is crystallized in the part of a lot of viewers that the other candidates don't yet offer. So I would say the four of them right now are the top tier. And then candidates like Elizabeth Warren and Cory Booker and Amy Klobuchar could certainly rise up, but it's unlikely that all of them would.
Senator Harris took on a very interesting strategy this weekend. There's been this sort of conventional wisdom that for the Democrats to recapture the White House, it's important to bring back sort of beer-drinking, white leaning Democrat men. And she said, listen, the problem 2 years ago wasn't that Trump just picked up those men. Equally, they unmotivated was African-American women, African-American men. There was a whole mix of people who are unmotivated, and that the Democratic Party needs to attract both independents and hardcore Democrats within a much more multicultural sense. It was right after Joe Biden. That was a message after Joe Biden's message. Did that get any energy? And did that motivate people to rethink what the mix is to be able to recapture the White House?
I don't think most voters are thinking strategically in that kind of way. I also think that she has a very good point, but it's not necessarily a novel point. From the day that the election returns came in 2016, the debate became, did Obama voters, who were these white blue-collar people, move over to Trump? Or was it that the obvious core Democratic voters, mostly women and people of color, were not sufficiently enthusiastic about Hillary Clinton that they stayed home? And, it's tricky because those are two very different types of voters. So the question becomes, can you have a strategy that appeals to both of them? And what we're seeing in Kamala Harris and Joe Biden look to be two competing strategies, although I don't think the Biden campaign would argue that that's what they're doing. The Biden campaign is clearly trying to generate enthusiasm among progressives, among women, among people of color. The Charlottesville narrative is obviously intended to do that. So, this is a situation where voters are not, at this point, paying close enough attention, I don't think, to these kinds of nuances. What the candidates need to do is make the case to the Democratic electorate that they're going to be able to beat Donald Trump. And whether they're able to make that case by saying that they're going to appeal to people who voted for Trump, or they're going to make sure that people turn out who didn't turn out last time around, is up to them. Whoever makes the strongest argument, I think, garners the nomination.
We get white papers from all sorts of folks. It seems like for us, in seeing all these, Elizabeth Warren puts out high-quality, thoughtful, big ideas on a regular basis. They have meat, they have potatoes. These aren't just generic taglines for a campaign. They're real policy. Why isn't she getting more energy, attracting more momentum as she puts forth, I would argue, the most comprehensive set of ideas within the campaign?
I'd agree with that, and I'd add that she's also, if not the most, then one of the most effective communicators of nuanced policies that I've ever seen. She's able to explain policy, fiscal policy in particular, in a way that I've never seen any candidate, maybe apart from Bill Clinton, communicate to the American people. Part of the reason she's not gaining traction has to do with baggage that accompanies her, that she has brought on herself over the course of the last couple of years. The Native American heritage thing, the constant sparring with the president. I think a lot of people look at her and can imagine what a Warren-Trump contest looks like. And it's a contest that probably looks like Trump wins. She and Hillary Clinton don't have that much in common if you look specifically at their backgrounds and the way that they're pushing forward, they push different policies forward. But something that they do have in common is that they were outspoken, vocal critics of Donald Trump. And we've seen the way that he's responded to them. And I think a lot of people look at that and think it's a fight that she can't win.
Where do we go next in the next couple weeks? Obviously, the stock market's taken a couple hiccups yesterday and today. The markets don't like trade conflict and higher tariffs. The House leadership has multiple initiatives, tax returns, potential impeachment, Barr coming before key committees, a whole host of initiatives. What's the next couple of weeks look like?
I think the most important thing that can happen in the next couple of weeks is actually what the state of New York decides to do about Trump's tax returns. Because it seems like the New York state legislature is in the process of moving forward, and they will allow New York to release those tax returns. The information in those returns is virtually the same as what they would get had Steve Mnuchin allowed the IRS to turn over the returns to Congress. And once that information is out there, it opens up a plethora of options, I think, for Nancy Pelosi and the House. So that's sort of where we are in terms of investigatory power and the ability to sort of skirt the roadblocks that the Trump administration is trying to put up. So that's where I'm looking for the next week or so.
Democrats seem, when they are frustrated on initiatives to try and change the rules, we've really never allowed an individual's tax return to be publicly released without their consent. A few years ago, the United States Senate, under Democratic hands, decided to end cloture votes on things like Supreme Court justices, and that has led to majority votes on a number of Republican conservative Supreme Court justices. Is this be careful what you wish for in changing the kind of the policy rules of America that have been consistent for a period of time, and open up a really new period of time that can be manipulated by both parties in the future?
It certainly is. And that very concern is part of what has traditionally reined all of our elected officials in. They don't necessarily do everything they can do because they wouldn't want that done to them.
Right.
And I think right now we're seeing a set of last resort tactics because the traditional rules and mechanisms by which politicians play don't seem to apply. You know, we were under the impression for a long, long time that it would be a problem if a presidential candidate was not willing to release his or her tax returns. Donald Trump demonstrated that it wasn't a problem, but now there are also, it didn't hurt him electorally. But now there are also reasons to believe that there are more nefarious problems associated with those documents. And so I think the Democrats just have to weigh, is getting that information more important than what those kinds of documents might turn up among their own members? And, you know, I can bet that that's the calculus right now. And they're trying to figure out who their most vulnerable people are should this kind of dissemination of information apply to all of them.
Professor, I want to thank you so much. As always, a wildly insightful look at what's going on a real-time basis into what's going on in Washington, D.C., both at the White House and on Capitol Hill. Anything I forgot to ask you about?
No, I think that's a lot. Tomorrow it'll be all new, but as of today, I feel like we're up to date.
Professor, thanks so much. Everybody else, please stand by. I've got Dr. Ed Iannicelli coming in to talk about the world of horse racing, always in the news, especially after this past weekend. Stay tuned. Right now, we're going to be back in 30 seconds.